Tori. O-R-I.
Madeline did it.
She's really overwhelmed. She's a good public speaker, though.
She is.
Mhm.
And she absorbed a lot of information. I showed them at the time. Those were hard questions.
Mhm. They were really hard.
You gonna stick around?
I think I'm gonna stick around, but
I'm going to call to order the September 12th, 2024 Lexington Planning Commission meeting. And before we even get started, we're going to welcome our newest member, Tori Bates, to the Planning Commission. So thank you so much for your service. All right, so the first item on the agenda is approval of the agenda. Do we have any comments or concerns or?
Just a question. So we're not pursuing item A in new business tonight?
request by the applicant because he had a conflict
Right.
that be postponed to your next meeting.
Okay. So that's not on the agenda for tonight.
It's on the agenda. You have to open it up and then postpone it
Okay.
to a vote. But if there's any other discussion item, now would be the time to add that to the agenda.
No, I just wanted to clarify that because I knew we were moving it to the end of the month. So,
Right.
Okay. Thank you, Arnie. So I move to approve the agenda as presented.
I second. All in favor?
Aye.
And opposed? And motion carries. Thank you. And next is approval of the minutes from the August 22nd, 2024 meeting. Do we have any comments? They are
I have one small correction.
okay.
On page 2 of 6 at the very bottom. This is most unusual. There is a small error. I think it's a Freudian slip. It's 15-year leash on educational facility rather than lease.
The very last line, like at the very top.
Yeah.
Really?
Yes. As in a leash for you all, not a lease for the. Oh, yes. No, you're right. That is what I said. Sorry, I'm like, oh, yeah, I said that.
Thank you so much. Okay. I couldn't, I was just, okay. But otherwise they're as wonderful. And these were tough minutes. So thank you, Kate. You did a
Yes,
great job.
Thank you. All right. Do I have a motion?
Oh, well, I always put the motion first for minutes since I like them so much. I move to approve the minutes as presented.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
And opposed? And the motion carries. All right, citizens' comments on matters not on the agenda. If there are any members of our audience who would like to come up and make a comment on an item that is not on the agenda, I would welcome you to do that at this point. And seeing as there are not, we're going to close that item. And now we are moving on to new business. So first item under new business is CUP 2024-05, an application by John Adamson for approval of a conditional use permit allowing portions of the Rockbridge building located at 9-17 South Main Street, tax map 23-1-72A, to be used as an educational facility, college, university, and as a public assembly. Now the applicant has requested a continuance to the next available planning commission public hearing date. What do we need? A motion to?
I had a bit of a speech prepared in the sense that I was going to sort of direct you what you could do because I thought you would add to the agenda discussion about the items that you
You're right,
had
Arnie.
in that memo. So
Yeah.
that's why I was trying to lead in earlier about, did you want to add a discussion to the agenda? So if I'll just jump into this, and if you want to go back and address the agenda and add something to that.
Thank you very much. I completely slipped my mind.
Okay, sorry. So we want to make sure that we're separating that discussion out from this. So we're going to.
So I was going to lead into that by simply stating that you have options. Yes, the applicant cannot be here this evening because he had a conflict on his schedule. He's asking that be postponed to your next meeting, which is on the 26th. So you have the option of opening that, which you have, voting on it without much discussion, or you can go ahead and discuss that particular conditional use permit application if you so choose. Typically, you just adhere, you follow the request and it's postponed as requested. We do have copies of that application, that staff report from the last time, in case you do open it up and have a discussion. You can certainly do that even without the applicant being here. If you choose not to do that, or if you choose to go ahead and close that up, postpone it, and then that's done, then you really can't talk about it. But you have asked for some additional information regarding CUPs in general, the WNL campus master plan, and some of the comp plan strategies that are particularly focused on WNL. So this is background information. And if you go that route, we really cannot speak about the Rockbridge building conditional use permit at all. And I would steer you away from even mentioning that property. You can talk about the other property that you've already dealt with at your last meeting, which is the courthouse across the street.
Mhm.
You've already made your recommendation there, so that's in your past and you can discuss that. But I would highly recommend that you, well, I guess I would recommend that you go ahead and postpone as requested, and then add to the agenda another item for this discussion. And this is the memo that was sent to you yesterday, I believe, yesterday afternoon. Sorry that was a bit late, and sorry that it's not terribly well written, but it was a little bit of a short time frame, and therefore it's in the format that it's in.
And again, I'm gonna, just for the record, thank you so much for
Mhm.
accommodating that request
Sure.
at
Mhm.
the last minute.
Shannon, Shannon, can I ask a quick
yeah,
procedural
yeah.
question? I'm sorry. So as I have recused myself from discussion of that particular conditional use permit, and as that's open right now, I'm certainly going to abstain from voting even on the continuous. Procedurally, should I be stepping down at this moment, or should I just sit right here?
As long as there's no discussion, if it simply goes straight to a motion to postpone, I don't think you need to do that extra step.
And I'll just abstain from voting on anything. Thank you.
Okay, so I think that our intention would be to have that discussion with the applicant present. So do we have a motion to postpone until?
I move that we postpone the discussion for CUP 2024-05 until such time as Mr. Adamson can be present.
I
And I just
second.
ask that that be to the next meeting specifically. That way I don't have to re-advertise.
Okay.
Yeah.
Next, which is the 26th of September.
And do we
I
have
second.
Okay, and all in favor
I,
and opposed? And we have one abstention from John. So thank you so much. We will close that item. And I think we'll open up the agenda. What do we need to do in order to open up the agenda
You
officially?
just ask, are there any amendments to the agenda?
Okay. Are there any amendments to the agenda?
yes,
John?
Arnie has accommodated a request from yourself and myself to have a general discussion on conditional use permits and has given us information for consideration for that discussion. It's not meant to take the whole meeting. It's just meant to be information, especially for newer members that may not be familiar with it. So I move that we amend the agenda to allow a discussion on the conditional use permit process.
Do we have a second?
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? And the motion carries. All right. Arnie, I think we'll put that next on the agenda. So if you wouldn't mind.
Okay, and sorry for the people in the audience. We have a memo that we may have an extra copy or two, but
There's
probably
actually-
not enough for everybody for this general
I have
discussion.
two
that's gonna
extras right
occur.
Mhm.
Okay, so following the memo, this was a request by the chair and Commissioner Driscoll to review the conditional use permit approval process, campus master plan for WNL, and relevant comprehensive plan strategies. So just following through, the first part is really a primer on conditional uses. Something that you've all seen and also have had training if you've gone through the land use education programs training for planning commissioners. In our use matrix, we have that nice spreadsheet that goes on forever. Well, that's not true. It lists a number of uses in the left-hand column, and then across the top, it has all of our zoning districts. And either there's a space there, so that means that that particular use in that particular zoning district is just prohibited. If there's a C, it's a conditional use. If it's a B, it's by right. So we always talk about by right uses and conditional uses. By right uses are automatically allowed. By right, you can do them. Typical would be in an R1 or R2 zoning district, your single family house is by right. You do not have to come to us, meaning all of us, and ask for a conditional use permit or any further zoning approval for it. It is by right, it is automatic. In contrast to that, conditional uses, those are uses that are presumed to have potentially an impact greater than a by right use. So they may be appropriate, they may not be appropriate given certain conditions. One example I like to give is a church in the middle of a residential area. If it has a relatively small sanctuary, say it's only got 50 seats or 100 seats, it may be easily accommodated within that neighborhood. But if it's a mega church with thousands of seats, it's probably not. So the condition is the number of seats in the sanctuary. So conditional use permits are legislative in nature. And we do have the ability to allow that permit to be revoked if the use is found to be in violation with the permit's conditions. That is not specifically listed in state code. It is specifically listed, believe it or not, for Board of Zoning Appeals, because in 1586, I think it is, or 2286 in the state code, Board of Zoning Appeals, and this is an aside, you don't need to remember this. Board of Zoning Appeals have the ability to hear conditional use permits or what they call special exceptions as well. They're interchangeable, those two terms. We do not. Obviously, the Planning Commission and Council ends up being approving those. So it's the zoning, for some reason, the Board of Zoning Appeals has the specific enabling legislation pointed out that they can revoke a permit. It's not so stated for planning commissions or for councils, but it is implied and has been interpreted. And I think there's even case law that says we have the right to revoke a permit if they are not following those conditions. Now, what I would recommend is in our next update to the zoning ordinance, we specifically put that in our particular code.
And do you all have that written somewhere
It
as
is.
a note?
It's a note on my particular version. I need to put it in the so-called hot file for the next annual amendment.
that'd
And
be
then
great.
there's another little tidbit that comes along with that. So conditional use permits are considered by a governing body or subject to suitable regulations and safeguards. And these suitable regulations and safeguards should include the requirement that the Planning Commission take timely action. That's the other little tidbit. We do not, in our specific code, say that the Planning Commission has 100 days, but it is a best practice to tie your time period for reviewing these to 100 days. And the 100 days is the same period that is actually in state code for rezonings. So that is the other little zoning text amendment that we should include in the next annual update.
Right.
They also should point out that you do not have to necessarily approve just because it meets all the conditions. This is legislative. You have discretion. You can still deny something even if it technically meets your criteria. And the other part to mention is the state does not have specific criteria. The criteria that we have, I presume we formulated and adopted at some point in the past. And we'll get to those in a minute. Board of Zoning Appeals, another example, they have specific state criteria in state code that we follow word for word for variances. That's not true for conditional use permits. So at some point in the past, we have developed A through D, and then the other one, the additional one that we're following in number 3, and we'll get to those. Impacts from a conditional use are addressed through conditions, and conditions are not voluntary. When we put a condition on, they should be following it. And again, if they are not following it, we have the ability to revoke it. Conditions may include the period of validity for special exceptions or special uses. This was newly added in 15.2-2286A3 recently. And this was a question that was brought up not long ago. Do we have the right to put a time frame on? And I told you yes. And thankfully, it's actually not just accepted practice, is actually now in state code. So conditions may include the period of validity. or special exceptions or special use. Again, special exceptions is the same thing as a conditional use permit. Some jurisdictions call them one thing and some call them the other. And then there's a little bit of a caveat there. However, in the case of a special exception or a special use permit for residential projects, the period of validity shall be no less than 3 years. I don't know the intent there, but I can only imagine that if you're going to have somebody either create a dwelling unit or somebody move in, they want to at least be there 3 years before it potentially is revoked. This is also important in that conditions must be reasonably and proportionally related to the impacts resulting from the use. Conditional uses are presumed to have an impact greater than what you would have with a by right use. So what is the impact from that particular use in that zoning district? And then once you determine that, you can put in a condition to address that expected or presumed impact. Second to that is it has to be proportionally related. So you can't go overboard with your condition if the impact is only somewhat minimal. I can't think of a good example at the moment, but you cannot, it has to be proportional to the expected impact. And a decision on an application is a legislative act again. So the governing body has a wide latitude in making a decision. The decision to deny a conditional use permit is reasonable if the landowner fails to meet all the requirements. And then we have these 5 reasonable grounds to deny a conditional use permit. By far and away, we approve just about everyone. It's rare for there to be a not denial, maybe 1 per year at most. And we don't really handle that many either, but just to give you some numbers, there aren't that many that end up being denied. But here, 5 reasonable grounds to deny a conditional use permit. The first one is the landowner fails to meet all of the requirements. And even if the requirements are satisfied, as mentioned previously, the decision maker retains the authority to deny the permit if sound zoning principles justify the decision. Number 2, the proposed use is inconsistent with the comprehensive plan. Luckily, one of our criteria mentions the comprehensive plan, so that's tied in. Number 3, the proposed use would have adverse impacts on the character of the neighborhood. Sometimes that's obvious, sometimes it's not so obvious, and sometimes you have to make a judgment call. Or lots of times you have to make a judgment call. Number 4, the proposed use would have adverse impacts on roads or create a hazardous traffic situation. Number 5, the proposed use would have an adverse impact on the abutting property. Please ask any questions as I'm going along.
I do
Don't
have a
hesitate
question
to
about
interrupt.
number 4.
Okay.
So when you say an adverse impact on roads, does that mean just, what does that mean?
If you're getting to parking, I don't know the answer to that necessarily. So again, you have latitude. So if you think that a particular use would create so much additional traffic generation, and then we also have some guidelines for that. I'm going to jump to the Spotswood property, and I'm not going to remember my numbers exactly. But so the Transportation Engineers Handbook has a chart of some sort, and the number of trips, if it goes up over a certain number, then you should be doing a traffic study.
Right.
So, and in our case, we had 62 units, and according to the number of trips that they presume happen for each dwelling unit, we were at 1/3 of the threshold for actually needing a traffic generation, traffic study. Traffic impact analysis is actually what it's called. So there are standards built in that we can lean on to determine if there's an adverse impact. And sometimes it's, the road, it's in your neighborhood, and that on Sunday mornings X happens, and it's just not going to be suitable for a church, as an example, to go in there.
Right.
Does that answer partially?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. So parking is what I'm hearing, or is it just not?
Like everything, it depends. And I would state that if we use our example of anything downtown, we're supposed to take care of the parking in the sense that it's a utility. So they're in the C1 zoning district, there isn't a parking off-street parking requirement. Because again, we provide the parking. And I say we, I mean the city.
Mhm.
On-street parking, parking lots that we own. And there have been we have at least 2 traffic studies. Sorry, we have 2 parking studies on our shelf. They're dated, mind you. And just to further add, almost all parking studies say that there are enough parking spaces. Totally overgeneralization here, and it's more about management, but that's an aside. So back to parking downtown specific, there is no off-street parking requirement. So it would be hard, I think, to justify denial based on parking when we don't even require off-street parking.
And how old is our most recent
So
parking
I was
study?
hoping
Do
weren't
you?
gonna ask that.
any-
I have to go back and look. It's more than a decade, if I
Okay.
remember correctly. And then the other one's another decade and a half or so older than that. So they are dated.
Okay.
But again, in most cases that I know of, there's not a parking issue, there's a management issue. And I think you could make that argument here too,
Sure.
in the city of Lexington as well.
Mhm.
And John, did you have?
Well, I wait till the end. It was just, I'll wait till you
Yeah.
finish, Arnie. Go ahead on the 5th one.
And then past that one. So the denial of a conditional use permit will be reversed if the governing body ignores its standards and then fails to present any evidence to justify its decision. The denial of a special use permit is arbitrary if the decision is not related to any zoning interest, but is instead motivated principally by the heavy opposition of neighbors expressing concerns not related to any zoning interest. And that's sometimes the hardest part when you have folks in front of you that are stating one after the other that they don't like it, but they can't really tie it to a zoning interest. If it's a land use issue, if it's they just don't like it because of some other reason that's not tied to zoning, then those are tough public hearings, and it's tough to make a decision sometimes in the face of that. A court may also find that a denial of a conditional use permit does not have a rational basis if it is shown that the standards are being applied in an inconsistent and discriminatory manner. Discriminatory, I think, is somewhat obvious, but inconsistent, I think sometimes we struggle with that because we think that, okay, if we make this decision for this type of conditional use permit at this time, then we have to be consistent with the next one or have the exact same outcome for the next one. But you don't, because it's always case by case. I understand that you would want to have sort of the appearance of some consistency and not be all over the place with your decisions. But they are, just to point out, case by case, and each case is different. And just because you voted one way on one doesn't mean that you're obligated to do the same on the next very similar case. And then any appeals from that decision for conditional use permit by the local governing body go to circuit court. Any questions about sort of the process and how we handle conditional use permits?
Just these 5 conditions or the grounds that they're out of what? The state code or?
That's a good question. I have a document here that when I went for training to be a certified zoning administrator and the testing and all that, this was part of the training materials, and it is from Greg Kampner. He's the county attorney, at least he was in 2017. And this is an excellent resource for me. It covers everything. Dillon rule, scope of meetings, appeals as zoning administrator, vested rights, all those things. So these are a list that he has compiled.
Okay.
And there were a few more in there, and I certainly didn't give you all of them. But I think we struggle a little bit more with denials or justifications for denials. So that's why I put those in there.
Yeah, I think that's helpful.
The approvals are somewhat
Yes.
easy,
Yeah.
Right.
relatively.
Thus, we only have one denial every year, right?
Yeah. Probably, maybe not even
According
that.
to your, what you said.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
So just to go through our specific conditions, again, these are not from the state code, but we have the right to put in conditions for issuance. So on the bottom of page 2, just reading some of that from our own code, conditional use permits may be issued for any of the uses for which a conditional use permit is required. Our provisions of this chapter, again, that's our land use matrix where we have them all listed out. provided that the governing body upon a recommendation by planning commission shall find that, and then A, B, C, and D that you're very familiar with, and that part of number 3 that I've underlined. So A, the proposed use will not affect adversely the health and safety of persons residing or working in the neighborhood of the proposed use. And you'll notice how sort of high level these are. I would argue that you therefore have a lot of leeway when you're making a determination whether or not it is for denial or for approval.
And these are pretty closely related to the 5 reasonable
Yeah.
grounds. Yeah.
Luckily, luckily.
Great. Yeah.
So in the next one, the proposed use will not be detrimental to the public welfare or unduly injurious to property values or improvements in the neighborhood. We sometimes have that question or statement from a neighbor, that thing that's going in beside me is going to negatively affect my property values. And one thing I remember specifically in one of our public hearings from Brian Kearney, local attorney, it has to be pretty darn obvious. You can't just say that that thing is going to negatively affect my property value. It has to be something really obvious. I'm going to go back to an old use like a tannery or something going in beside your house, which is just an absolutely obnoxious type use, then yes. But if it's just something that maybe a duplex is going in next to your single family, you really can't argue that it's going to be unduly injurious to your property value. C, the proposed use will not be in conflict with the policies and principles of the city's adopted comprehensive plan. Those are also very high level, and you could argue those sometimes either way. And we're going to be discussing at least one of those in a little bit. But it does make sense that your zoning actions, be they rezonings, be they conditional use permits, that they should be in compliance or at least in conformance with the policies and principles of your comp plan. The last one in this list, at least, is adequate public services, including streets and other traffic ways, utilities, police, and fire protection are or reasonably will be available to support the proposed use. I'm not sure that we've ever really had an issue. We're built out city with all those services. We're not greenfield. We don't have that issue of we're now putting a 3,000 unit subdivision out somewhere that may not have all of those utilities and services. And the last one to read in the record is that part of 3 that's underlined, that as well. So in granting conditional use permit, the governing body shall give due consideration to relevant factors and other subsections, as well as to any other reasonable land use and zoning considerations as may be required by the nature of the proposed use, or as may be otherwise appropriate to effectuate the intent of this chapter. So even if something does meet A, B, C, and D, you still have a lot of leeway in 3 to decide otherwise. Any specific questions about our current criteria?
Anyone?
And then we had a couple of statements or questions that I've responded to, or at least given you my 2 cents in italics. So the first one there being, W&L is utilizing the CUP process to circumvent the campus master plan approval in order to further encroach into Lexington's downtown. Well, this will be better answered perhaps after I discuss a little bit about W&L and their campus master plan, but just to quickly state, they have a campus master plan for a finite area, campus proper, and then some things that are not adjacent immediately to campus, but fraternities and other things that are. So all of those things are specifically included in the campus master plan. And then these other things that they sometimes ask conditional use permits for are not included in the campus master plan because they're not part of campus proper or campus addendum. The other areas that are all W&L, the fraternity houses, an example, over towards Davidson Park, those are not adjacent to campus, they're on the other side of town, but that is still part of the campus master plan because that was provided to you in the campus master plan map. So again, the question or the statement that sometimes they may appear to be circumventing the campus master plan by further encroaching in Lexington's downtown. And my response to that is, first, there's no outright prohibition forbidding W&L from being a tenant in an existing building that I'm aware of, I should say. So
I would agree.
that land use strategy that we do have in the comp plan 2.3 that encourages W&L to keep any new construction within its current campus boundaries, to preclude a loss of local business and industry, and to limit the loss of taxable land. You can read that maybe a couple of different ways or more. I would suggest that this is not new. Some of our projects are not new construction. I'll take the courthouse as an example. That's not a new construction project. And the other two parts of that they preclude the loss of local business and industry. That's up for debate. I think you could certainly argue either way, depending on the type of use or what the use is that's proposed and what was in the building previously and what could be in the building in the future. And then the last part of the third part of that, and to limit the loss of taxable land. In the examples that we have, in particular, the courthouse, that is not a loss of taxable land because that is not owned by W&L. That's owned by a private owner and leased to W&L. Any questions there?
I would ask about this new construction. Well, actually, yes. So because Lexington has a historic downtown and an overlay district, would you consider new construction only construction that is happening on a whole building, or are we, or is if we leave the shell of the building and then completely renovate the interior of a building, is that might one consider that new construction within the confines of a historic district?
I would interpret this, and it's certainly open to each of our individual interpretations, that land use strategy encouraged W&L to keep any new construction within its current campus. I read into that, even though it's not specifically stated, that W&L, when they own a building and they have new construction, they should keep it on the campus.
Mm-hmm.
Conversely, and I have no proof of this, but I do not recall, as we were going through the comprehensive plan and we revised this, this strategy was in there, but it was tweaked a little bit, as I recall. But we knew at that time that W&L already had offices in other buildings downtown that are owned by John Adamson. So if there would have been a desire at that time to say something a little bit stronger, such as W&L should also not lease space downtown in order to prevent creep, then you would think we would have done that, but we didn't do that. That's not included in the comp plan. Now, some of you were also here at that point and you may have a better recollection than I do, but I do not recall that particular discussion, and I would have expected if it was something that was strongly desired, then we'd have a separate strategy in our land use chapter.
Sure. But to the point of new construction, I mean, it's not really about W&L. That's just sort of a definitional question. Is new construction only when you're talking about the exterior of a building, or is renovation, like when you're talking about a historic district, how much of the interior of buildings has to stay intact?
For tax credit purposes?
In our downtown.
But even if we had sort of the tax credit metric, that doesn't apply to this. This is just however you interpret it. So there isn't something that we have anywhere else that I'm aware of that says new construction means X as far as the comp plan goes.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
I think you have to interpret it.
Right. So that is literally the only thing that's, and it is in fact about W&L. Okay. Thank you. Does anybody else have any?
Well, I would just add that I think Arnie's point is that it is open to interpretation, as any of these are. I think in our general discussions, the intent is speaking to expansion. I think if you hold to the letter, the way Arnie is describing it, then you would say this is not new construction. And some of these issues, just depending on your opinion goes back to being on legal grounds if you are going to deny or put unreasonable conditions. On that one, I would say the further loss of local business and industry is the one that may be open to interpretation if the tax issues are covered. And that's often misunderstood about the tax issues, and I think it's good to have this discussion. So that's all. I think it's the difference between a very strict definition and what was the intent. Or what is the intent, and that's open to interpretation.
I'm glad you said taxable because that reminded me, we will very likely have on your next agenda, and it'll be up to you if you want to have it before the continued CUP discussion for the Rockbridge building, something from either our city manager or our finance director about W&L and their pilot and the other fees that they pay. So that might help you with some of that understanding about what's at least W&L, what their commitments are and how what they're paying.
Is this something that we're going to be asked to vote on, or is just a presentation?
Again, background information, because they were working on it anyway for another reason. And when I provided our city manager with a copy of this, as I sent it out to you all, I copied him. Then he said, well, we're working on this and we can have it ready. So it's likely to be on your agenda. Again, additional background information about W&L in particular and about their payment in lieu of taxes and some of the other fees that they pay.
Okay. Yeah, I would say let's put that ahead of the discussion. That would be great. Thank you.
Only one question. Sorry for new members if this is getting into too many details, but it's important to sort it out. Sometimes I get confused between those broader categories for the criteria for the conditional use permit and a discussion like this if we're bringing in taxes in the discussion. And in some ways, I almost feel with the planning commission, we don't get into that. You know, the tax issue, as you note at the end of your note, is really something for council. But I guess the tricky part is how to bring in some of these issues that don't relate exactly to the 4 criteria, but are still in the discussion. And
it is true that we have in the past recommended if it's more about sort of the budget and the revenues and some of those more financial discussions, what the impact may be from a particular use, because council sets the budget, they have that in the back of their mind. And if somebody says this is going to have a negative impact on the budget, you all don't deal with the budget. So it's a little bit perhaps unfair of you to make that sort of decision or determination. So we do sometimes recommend that you just push that part of it or dismiss that part of it and push it on a council as a responsibility.
Yeah. In general, just for those who don't know, W&L does pay taxes in lieu of I forget the official name. We'll get it next week. But for the 13 fraternities, they pay an amount. I won't quote it in case I'm wrong by next week. And then there's another amount for the 15 properties that they own in the city.
Right. And that will all be detailed for you at the next meeting.
Right. And they would not, they don't pay taxes on the courthouse, correct? That's John Adamson.
The property owner does.
Yeah,
Correct.
yeah.
And you could argue if they pay it through their lease or not, but
right.
it gets paid.
Yes.
And the second part to that sort of response is that just an observation that educational facility was added in 2017. And anytime that we have something that is related to a university use, then now we have additional oversight through the CUP process. And that's obvious in the last 2. So there is additional oversight for W&L when they're in the C1 zoning district because of the definition that we added and because of the specificity that we added in the definition, and these administrative uses are an example of that. And to put perhaps another point on that, if somebody else comes in and it puts in a doctor's office downtown, they don't have to go through the conditional use permit process. But since we added educational use, which was already a conditional use permit, and then we further specified other facilities, administrative facilities and dorms and other things, if it's any of those, they actually have to come in and get a conditional use permit for an office where other users don't have to. So we did, intentionally or not, add in a little bit more oversight for WNL and administrative facilities in the C1 zoning district.
Do you recall why? Okay.
I suspect, and I hate to do this, but I suspect it was simply because we did not, in the CUP for the courthouse, we had that public facility or public assembly, but it wasn't called that. It was the older version, and it was private school. But private school we didn't even have a definition. So we needed something to plug in for private school. We came up with a definition, and it was a two-part definition: educational facility, university, college, and educational facility, primary, secondary. So I think it's something that we just added and may not have completely understood the impact of the administrative facilities portion of the educational use, that WNL would therefore have to come in for a conditional use permit when they were even or simply adding offices downtown. So the next question, what is the history of using CUPs and why have we been moving away from them? Going back to 2016, 2017, Berkeley Group was hired, and they noticed that there were quite a number of CUPs and quite a number of CUPs that were on a timeline or a renewal period. A great example that I always use, an example that I always use is our large capacity houses. We had 8 or so at that point, and we have many fewer now. But depending on the mood or depending on if there was any violation of any one of those, sometimes they were on a 5-year batch renewal, sometimes they were on a 2-year, sometimes they were on a 1-year, and they were never denied. They were always, and there were so many conditions that came. I think there are 19 conditions. Half of them, in my opinion, weren't even enforceable. That's an aside. So that whole process of continually asking folks to come in for a conditional use permit renewal and then not really revoking them led us to recommend that those standards, that there not be required to come in so often for those. And then also in addition to that is, if you have a lot of conditional use permits, then there's less transparency. I would argue there's less transparency in your code. So if you are asking whether or not you can do this particular use on your property and it's a conditional use, well, then it's legislative. Yes, the locality has greater control over it, but you have no idea, because honestly, it's a political process. You don't know if your neighbor is going to show up or not. So it really clouds whether or not it adds in a good bit of uncertainty on whether or not that use will be approved or will not. And people will simply shy away from it. They will not come in and ask for a conditional use permit because they do not want to go through that public hearing process. Now, that's their right as the owner, but the observation and the best practice that we were recommending at the time and still do is that conditional use permits end up, it's better to stay away from them as much as possible. You simply can't in some cases, but a best practice would be to develop standards for a use that may have impacts. Accessory dwelling units, we have a number of use and design standards for those. Mind you, we didn't make those by right, but as much as possible, the recommendation was develop use and design standards for a use so that somebody would understand, okay, if I want to do that on this piece of property in this zoning district, those are the standards. If I can meet those standards, I get to do it by right. It's just clearer, and I would say more transparent. So that was the recommendation from staff at that point, and is still the recommendation from staff. So I wouldn't say that we're moving away from them. It's not a sort of process. That was during the update in 2016, 2017. That was the recommendation then, and we tried as much as we could, even though I distinctly remember those 2 very long public hearings that Planning Commission held where they were going through different portions of the land use matrix, trying to figure out, should that be by right? Should it be prohibited? Should it be conditional? the knee jerk was always, oh, that's going to be difficult in that district. Maybe that should be conditional. So you always wanted more control, not you. We always wanted more control, and it was hard to give up that control and go with a by right that had condition or that had standards that went along with that. So I wouldn't say that we're moving away like in a continual process, but it is a best practice, in my opinion, that it's more, the clarity is there if we develop standards and have more by right uses where we can.
Okay.
Sorry, that was wordy.
Nope, that was helpful.
So it goes that continuum between control and how predictable a use would be, or being able to have that use. Over on the next page, which is page 4, how are we going to handle CUPs going forward, given that previously Council and Planning Commission decided to avoid the irregularity of CUPs in favor of sticking with the zoning for each district? So uses that are listed in the zoning ordinance as conditional can only be approved through the conditional use permit public hearing process. So we will continue to handle the review of conditional use permits as we have in the past in accordance with the criteria established in the zoning ordinance for the review of CUPs. There's no avoidance, really, in my opinion, of CUPs in the zoning ordinance. And in fact, many uses remain listed as conditional uses, as I just explained when we went through that process. We just couldn't help ourselves and ended up still having a lot of conditional uses. But the last statement there, sometimes sort of observation as one gains a little bit of experience and a lot of gray hair, is that sometimes when you get to a point where you don't really know, you get flustered or have questions and aren't sure how to handle something, that sometimes it's just okay to trust the process. We have developed a comprehensive plan. We have developed a good one, in my opinion. We also have a process through the zoning ordinance on how to handle conditional use permits. So most things that we see are not brand new. They might be slightly different than what we've seen before, but it's just a little bit of a recommendation to trust the process, because again, it's likely not something that is brand new and not something I haven't seen before. Any questions there before I go on to the campus master plan?
Any discussion? Anybody?
I think one of the questions I've had, Arnie, and is if you get a conditional use permit request and the clock starts ticking, and then we have to evaluate it for as an individual request, on its merits. I think the question I've had is what happens when, and in this case, we might have a series of over, say, 10 years, that's hypothetical. Just say we have a series of requests related to a institution. How do you begin to look at the cumulative impacts versus the merits of the question the case that's before you? And I think that's one of the issues that I've been trying to think about.
I would always and will always direct you right back to the conditions. So those 5 conditions that we have for a CUP, because I presume you're asking about CUPs in particular.
Yeah.
And if you think that there is that cumulative impact and it's starting to erode the character or one of the comp plan strategies that talks about character of downtown or character of the city in general, then yes, you can say, hey, we're now, in my opinion, at the point where cumulatively, maybe not this one, but this is now the one that's pushed us over, in my opinion, to a point where we're affecting character negatively.
Or traffic or parking or et cetera. Okay.
There's nothing else about
And that is a completely subjective, the character, whether we are impacting the character, and that's requires one to think generationally, I would say, in terms of how does this impact 3 generations from now, or even 2 or 1 generation from now of the what we might look at as an iterative process of planning and sort of the back and forth between what the decisions are that we make and the things that come before us, and how that plays out in a physical context of downtown or wherever.
I always hate to be defensive and always say, keep in mind legal issues or, but as you're going through that process of, is this meeting, is it not meeting, is there cumulative impact over time? We're always in a better position if you can state in your discussion, in your motion for approval, for denial, how the particular request meets or doesn't meet the criteria that we have. So as long as, regardless of what side you're on, as long as you can justify your motion and your ultimate vote according to the criteria you have, that's all we ask of you, really. Again, it's not, you should be approving all these, you should be denying, it doesn't matter. As long as you can justify with the criteria, that puts us in a good defensible spot.
Okay.
And I would encourage you, honestly, if you have an opinion that something shouldn't be approved, don't hesitate to deny it. You don't have to necessarily convince all your other fellow commissioners about yours, but you can certainly state your case and vote your way. And if that's the way the chips fall, great. If not, you're making a recommendation in almost all cases, not for site plans, but in other conditional use permits, rezonings, whatnot, you're making a recommendation.
Yes, that's the one thing I remember from planning commissioner school. State your rationale.
As long as we can have that on the tape or in the minutes, we're in a good spot.
All right. Anybody have any comments or questions about so far? I mean, any further? Okay.
I want to move along, and I'm on page 4 still. Campus master plan for WNL. We actually have an expert here, so I may not cover it as well. But with our WNL master plan that we reviewed in 2022, we started out because I should back up a little bit, sorry. In your memo here, in 1999, we added to the zoning ordinance a new overlay zoning district. So the institutional district, it was designed to allow larger scale institutions such as universities and medical campuses to develop in accord with master plans approved by the city council. And by approval of a master plan, city council pre-authorizes various land uses that are described and located within the area incorporated within the master plan. Land uses not shown and described by the master plan can only be approved through the issuance of a conditional use permit after review and recommendation by the commission. I'm not sure if all of you remember the WYSIWYG software. WYSIWYG stood for what you see is what you get. So I sort of think of that when I think of a campus master plan. If it's on the plan and it gets approved that way, then that's what we get ultimately, because they still have to build it. But so it's what you see is what you get in that campus master plan. And then if it's not on the plan and it's something that they want to do, how do they accomplish that? They go through the conditional use permit process, or they can actually go back in and open the entire campus master plan up again and make that change, or they can come in and an individual basis, go through the conditional use permit process. And a good example of that is shortly after the campus master plan was approved, WNL came back for the student health center that is on East Denny. Is it Way or Lane? I can't remember. Beside the tennis courts. And they came in and did a specific conditional use permit to allow that new student health center, even though the campus master plan was just completed not long before that, within a year or two. So they had the ability to go through the public hearing approval process and do a campus master plan update. And the last time they had a number of, well, actually I get in that next. But then, so it's either an update to the whole thing or on an individual basis through the conditional use permit process. And that second paragraph, development standards such as building height, lot area, lot width, setback, and parking may be proposed as part of a submitted master plan. And if development standards are not proposed as part of a master plan, you just use what's in the underlying zoning district. Some of you may not be aware, and this is where it gets a little bit unnecessarily complicated, but we have the underlying zoning district. Most of WNL is in the R1, the residential zoning district, but then they have this campus master plan overlay district. So what they are asking for and what has been approved in that overlay is what they get to do. And if they don't ask for anything specific as far as like height, as an example, then you use whatever the maximum height is in that underlying zoning district. And I can't remember what it is in R1. It's either 35 or 45 feet. Another example of that for the Williams School, they actually asked for additional height, and I cannot remember what that height, but they included, again, what you see is what you get. So they specifically showed the Williams School addition or expansion that is being constructed now. And if the height in R1 is 45, they asked for 54 or whatever the actual number was. So they included that in this particular provision that I just read to you, allows us to go beyond the zoning standards as long as they specifically ask for it and show it in their campus master plan. Site plans are required for new development that are approved within the master plan if the new development is within 200 feet of a public street or within 200 feet of a boundary of the area included within the master plan. So sometimes you won't see a site plan come to you because it's right in the middle of campus. It's not within 200 feet of the boundary, or it's not within 200 feet of a public street. You did see it for the Williams School expansion because it is on a public street on Washington. Third paragraph there, it is an institutional overlay district. And then in anticipation of them submitting that submittal into 2022, we did hold a work session to go over some of these overlay based zoning district questions because we just hadn't done that in quite some time for WNL or for the hospital as an example. They did, and this is a really quick overview. They did submit a campus master plan. That request included a change to a future land use designation for one parcel, the rezoning of 6 properties to the institutional overlay, and an amendment to the university's master plan that included, I believe it was 9 capital projects. Sometimes you can argue if a thing is a capital project or not, and one of those ended up being out in the county, which is a softball field, so we didn't really address that one. And then after holding a number of public hearings, the city did approve a rezoning of 5 parcels and 7 capital projects. The city did not, however, approve the requested future land use map for that one parcel, and that one parcel was 12 Lee Avenue, which was the whole, which was supposed to be the Institutional History Museum on top of a parking garage. And they also did not approve the expansion of Wilson Hall or that Institutional History Museum that I just mentioned. And then additionally, through that public hearing process, WNL did withdraw their request for the housing that's included in the triangle, and the triangle being Glasgow, McLaughlin, and Myers Streets. I did not have a great map for you, so the map on page 5, because the campus master plan, which is this document, their boundary map is always sort of partial. So it's and at a scale that's a little bit hard to read. So it was also hard for me to pull it out of here. So what I gave you instead was this map that was provided during that process, which is supposed to show, I think, university facilities. I can't even read it. It's so small, but at least where they have uses. And you see, without the boundary that I told you, the campus master plan actually has a distinct boundary. But again, that map was hard for me to put in here quickly. So these are all the places where, or parcels or buildings where WNL has a function. And most of it's on campus proper, but you do see as you're heading out East Nelson Street, those fraternity houses that are split off in that area. And you also included here are Red Square and the Fiji House and a couple of others.
Isn't the courthouse?
The
Is
courthouse
that-
is shown in here, correct?
Yeah.
As is the old jail building where they have some offices as well directly behind the courthouse.
So they're considering buildings that they are renting as.
That's just shown on this map. I've got to be very careful. That's what's shown on this map, just showing where they have a presence.
It does say
We-
parcels. I'm just wondering.
And we have to go
So-
back and see if the question is, are those two specifically included in the campus master plan proper? I'd have to go back and determine that.
Yeah, I'm just wondering whether they're considering properties that they rent as
Mhm.
part of their master plan as opposed to parcels that they own.
I think this map and again, this isn't the approval map, so I have to be
Yep.
careful, but this does show the dance studio on Jefferson. It does seem to show the Hopkins house as an example. But this was more just for me to show you where they have
Sure.
a presence throughout town as opposed to what was specifically included on the campus master plan. Because again, in the time frame, I was not able to pull that quickly or easily from the approval.
But I think that might be an interesting
Mhm. We-
piece of information for us to have.
This is available and it's online.
Sorry, I just mean, do they consider rental properties to be part of their campus, subject to their campus master plan?
It all depends on what they showed in
Right.
their campus master plan when it was submitted to us. I think that those are not included, but I'm not going to say one way or the other until looking in depth or in detail for the submittal and what was approved. The other thing that we do have for you, just in case it comes up, is not copies of the entire glossy document that they hired architectural firm, I think, out of Boston to do, but the approval. So the approval letter that says specifically what was approved. The labor and library was one of the capital projects. The science center was one of the capital projects, and then also what wasn't, and then the ordinance that goes with it. So we have copies of those so that you could see specifically what was approved, and then you could always examine the actual campus master plan that was submitted during
Thank you so
that
much.
campus master plan application. That is linked on our planning department website, webpage.
Arnie, I think that Shannon's question's, it's a good one. And again, we want to get away, I mean, you have to be proper legally, but then there's also the question, the intent question. And that's why if we go back to why have we gone through such incredible efforts to create a master planning process, approval process, master plan, updates, approval, institutional overlay, goes back to why do we do all of that? And my assumption was, well, we want to have some say about what happens on the W&L campus and when it meets the adjacent neighborhoods. That's kind of the issue that so then the question is, well, that in a way, when you describe what was approved and not approved, in a large sense, the dividing line, the holding line was Lee Avenue when we approved the master plan or didn't and didn't approve some projects. So my question is, how do we accommodate the fact that this new educational conditional use permit process in a way doesn't negate that whole effort that everybody went through, but suddenly it allows the university as an institution to expand its presence beyond its campus footprint. I think that's what we're trying to sort out here.
Mm-hmm.
I think you look, where is the request proposed? So is it within the campus master plan? And if it is within that boundary, then you look
Yeah,
at whatever's in the
that's
campus
easy.
master plan.
Yeah, that's
If it's
easy.
not in it, then you utilize the rest of the zoning ordinance. You utilize the C1 zoning district, you utilize the conditional uses if it's a conditional use, which it is, so you use those criteria.
So, which would,
That's a good answer.
Yeah.
Thank you. I don't sure.
And then if you're
You're
worried
fine,
about-
Arnie. It's good.
and if it
You've
goes
laid it
to
out.
some
Yeah.
of the other issues that you've already talked about, cumulative, and
Yeah.
then you go to the criteria and you weigh those and you develop those for yourself in a way that you can then describe and make a motion and
Yep.
for approval or
No,
deny.
that's fair. And and my other point, because you still have to get to it, the second land use strategy, LU 5.6. So that's coming up. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm on page 6, unless there are any other questions. And that just describes the first paragraphs of sort of what's on the map. So I'm not going to cover that. So comp plan strategies, the two that we have that are specific to WL. Now, we've already talked about character, and there are all kinds of other strategies that you could make apply to a property. But the two that are specifically have WNL in them, land use, and again, that's land use chapter. So 2.3 is a strategy. Strongly encourage WNL to program new construction within the present university boundaries to preclude any further loss of local business and industry, as well as the loss of limited taxable land. We've already covered this a little bit, but happy to answer any other questions you may have about that particular one. Again, it's open to individual interpretation.
Okay.
And
thank
then the
you. Go
next
ahead.
one, land use 5.6, continue regular communication and coordination with WNL and VMI leadership to maintain Lexington's engagement in physical and programmatic additions to these institutions of higher learning.
Well, I think that's where the some of the less than specific issues can be addressed. And the question is, how does that regular communication coordination happen? I know it occurs regularly among staff and the city manager and possibly WNL. But in terms of a more public process, we haven't had one since 2 years ago when we had the WNL, the review of the WNL master plan. So I think this is one of the issues that I'm not sure if it falls within the planning commission to be doing or for the council to encourage. But I think we need a more, we need as I've been saying, a forum or some workshops with the university to kind of update some of these issues. And as some wise person said, some of the problems here may not necessarily be the legal or the regulatory side. It's more the softer relationship side between the university and the town.
And Arnie, who sponsored or organized the meeting around about the triangle, the public sessions? Was that planning commission? Was that council?
I don't recall specific, because they were within the first proposal, actually the second proposal. And then because through the public hearing process, as I recall it, there was enough pressure that they withdrew their proposal, which was a bit of an odd proposal, if I may say, where the fronts of the houses would stay and they would link the backs of the houses in some odd way, which I couldn't figure out because there's also fall to the properties. So, and then the services would be in the back and the new kitchens and bathrooms, but somehow the fronts would still look like they do. So it was a bit of an odd. And then through just public comment, they decided to withdraw the triangle entirety from the campus master plan. So that begs the question, what regulates it now? The R1 zoning district.
So
I don't remember specific if
right.
we held specific, so I don't recall that.
No. Yes, I'm just wondering whether that would be whether that would fall under our purview to in fact invite WNL to come and talk about the master plan and how that might inform our thinking or process going forward.
And I would say that there's not an obligation certainly for them, and it's a little bit open-ended in my view of this continued regular communication, that communication that happens with the city manager, with public works, with WNL and VMI, that happens fairly regularly. Is that sufficient for this, or is this more intended for the public process or public overview? And it's not terribly clear in here, I would say.
Yeah, I would.
So we could invite, but there's no obligation necessarily for WNL to show up and say, hey, we've just completed our campus master plan 2 years ago, and now we want to, unless they have something else that they want to add or modify, that's when they're going to come to us. We could certainly invite them. I would suggest that we do that on a sort of targeted issue. Right now, nothing's going on with the triangle, so I don't know necessarily why we would say triangle.
No, I
But,
don't think we would.
You had another example before the meeting where we could potentially have them maybe come by and just update us generally on projects, on priorities, on fundraising, and how that may affect those priorities. We could certainly ask.
Right. Or on their, their intention with regards to, the things that, what happened with on Preston, no, not Preston, Nelson Street, with the Press Brand building.
Mhm.
So that, sort of going in and, is that something that their intention is to sort of say, oh, well, this potential office space has come open, we'll go in and, work with the developer to make it into space that we could otherwise have on our very large campus, right, instead of downtown. So I wonder if that might be a helpful conversation for us to have as people who are being asked to make decisions that will impact the future of downtown.
Yeah, I'd agree. I was going to say something about that building and what a dog of a building it was and how nobody,
Absolutely.
but that's not
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
not the,
Yeah.
no. But the key phrase for me in that strategy is in physical and programmatic additions to these institutions of higher learning. And so I remember early in the campus planning process, when WNL was developing the plan, they went to council and gave a presentation to ask about the one-way street
oh yeah.
and
True.
that. And I remember I was chair at the time and I said, well, could you also come to the planning commission and do the same thing? And that led to a very good discussion among ourselves and you giving kind of a primer like you are tonight, which was helpful for the commission going forward when the request came to us. So I think some way of asking for a regular update on issues that affect this, like the downtown, would be very helpful and go back to dealing with what we're trying to grapple with on these larger cumulative effects rather than just each permit at a time. So
I think it would also have been nice like we can't talk about that property. If an application had come in and it said, this is swing space for X amount of time until one of the capital projects that is on the master plan that has been approved, until that gets
yes,
wiped away, completely reconstructed, has so much more square footage in that, but that wasn't provided.
Right. But a conversation like we're talking about
Yeah.
could facilitate that. And I think that would be great.
Okay, getting down towards the end of that page 6, some of the questions there or statement, historically, why have we tried to limit expansion of WNL into downtown? And I would say WNL expansion just about anywhere. It's just the impact. They are a big driver of a lot of revenue, a lot of traffic, a lot of impacts potentially. And then says here, support a downtown zone where businesses don't have to compete against a wealthy institutional neighbor for space. And I just added in, yes, as I recall, the story is there was backlash for the Hillel House, specifically for the cafe, because now WNL is putting in a cafe that's clearly open to the public, not just to students. It's now competing with other restaurants that are directly across the street. So that is at least I've only been here 8 years. That's one of the things that I recall from that type of institution, perhaps competing unfairly against other businesses in downtown.
And so there wouldn't necessarily be that many examples of that. I mean, a restaurant, a bookstore, a store, places that would, yeah. So that's the kind of thing. Yeah.
And the other thing that was listed in this list that was provided was ensure that tax base is maintained And yes, again, 2.3, the land use strategy that we've covered a couple of times, talks about the tax base in particular, and we'll get on to taxable land later. And then maintain the cultural and historical context of the community. That's up to your interpretation. It is clearly there is not much of an appreciation for the creep over time. And then why have we come up with this particular strategy that was, again, in a previous version? And I think we tweaked it to make sure, or to strongly suggest that, or encourage them to stay on the campus. Why has that been? Is it because of the historical context? I can only imagine it was, but I don't recall specifically, and certainly not the history of that particular strategy over time. I could only imagine that'd be one of the things. And then I'm going to just jump to number 6, direct traffic congestion affiliated with WNL toward WNL owned and controlled parking lots. And this direction is not provided specifically in the comprehensive plan. So I can't say whether or not that is one of the reasons that for that particular strategy, if that makes any sense.
Mhm.
I think I'm starting to babble. And the last one there is, what are the concerns about WNL's encroachments on the downtown? And the one issue there posited was potential loss of business tax revenue. So I just want to point out that the land use 2.3 talks about the loss of limited taxable land, doesn't specifically talk about business taxes. And I can't remember if it was honestly during our discussion last time around, but or maybe what I read on Facebook, which isn't always the best source. But some folks were arguing that perhaps if office use comes in or continues in a particular property, that then you don't have the ability for something that is retail related, that isn't just about the property tax, but then you're perhaps losing out on sales tax, might be losing out on meals tax or something else. But that's not really, in my opinion, at least, what the strategy is, the land use strategy 2.3. It only talks about the loss of limited taxable land, not about other business taxes. So I would, again, suggest you just leave that up to council for their review and if they include that in their decision or not. And that's all I have in this memo. Happy to answer any other questions, though, that may not have been included in it, or any other questions that you may have that have just come up tonight.
Well, thank you so very much for all of that background and discussion. Do we have any, does anybody have any thoughts about this? We're specifically not talking about the item that we postponed till the next meeting. But if anybody has anything that they would like to ask about, comment on, we're not going to open this up for public discussion or debate, or sorry, input, comment. But so within commission, if anybody would like to, ask questions, you are free to do so.
I think I've said enough tonight.
Okay.
But there's one other one. I couldn't help myself. No, hold on. Well, I think Arnie's done a great job in helping tonight, and I appreciate it very much. There are they're unwritten things that come up in the discussion. So for example, the loss of storefronts to activities. I've heard back from people to say, office uses don't really contribute to the vitality of the street in terms of people walking down. So some of these things are subjective, some of them are not. I don't know what always best practices are, but so there are lots of different options. And I'll stop there except to say that, Arnie, you've held a good class tonight, and I think those who haven't gone to planning commission school will get advanced credit.
Thank you. If you can remember it.
Okay, so ready?
That much fun.
You guys already know that. So another thing that didn't really get covered here is that housing is something downtown buildings can provide housing in the upper floors. And that's something that might also fall under the on that back page. Why might we try to limit expansion or want to limit expansion of WNL? Just in terms, there are, whether housing for whoever since it seems like something that we are encouraging, and this is not about WNL so much as just about turning spaces into strictly office spaces. I think that is something that we should at least, consider whether that is the approach that we do want to take.
If I could just add sort of an example there in our zoning ordinance, just what we have currently in the code. It says in the C1 zoning district, you should not have residential uses on the first floor unless it's hidden behind a lobby space, a retail space, or an office space.
Right.
So there you have to get a conditional use permit for anything on the first floor. That's all that we have as far as uses on the first floor. There's no other direction in our zoning ordinance for priority for retail space over office space, but office space is certainly less engaging than retail space. So that becomes that subjective part. So you have to consider what's actually in the code and then the subjective part, and how do you weigh that against the criteria?
Right.
Leave it at that.
Right. So as we move forward with these CUPs, there are lots of topics that will want to consider, I think. So thank you so much. I think that let's close this section of the meeting, this item of new business, and move on. I would propose that perhaps we, given the hour, table or not engage with the ZOA 2024-03. Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
I think that's an excellent idea, and Leslie will be back next week, and she's been a good part of the cottage housing question, so it'd be good to have her here.
True.
So do we need a motion?
Yes.
I need a motion. I don't know how to do it.
I move that we postpone discussion of
He's a vice chair.
ZOA 2024-03 until, what is the date of our next meeting again? September 26th meeting.
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? And the motion carries. Okay, so we are now on to item 6, other business, and the zoning and planning report.
I do not have a zoning and planning report.
All right. And anything on our key annual PC milestones? This is maybe something that you and I need to have a conversation about,
Whether or not we take it off or not, that's up to you.
or even how we
Yeah.
should utilize that section of the
True.
agenda. All right, and I assume that we don't have a city council report. Okay. So, gosh, here we are.
I move that we adjourn this very informative meeting.
I second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? And meeting is adjourned. Thank you so much. Thank you,
You're welcome.
audience, for hanging in there.